Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of these end times. Last week my sister called me up and she said, "You've got to watch this new Cartier watch commercial because it features a leopard." So I watched it, and I agree, it is a prophetic video. Now, it's not unusual for a Cartier watch commercial to feature a leopard because that is the logo of their company. However, this particular commercial is unique because it shows the construction of a leopard out of watch parts. Unfortunately, I believe this video is also a warning from the Illuminati, because if you watch the video in reverse, you see the deconstruction of the leopard. In other words, a possible assassination attempt on our president. First, however, I want to play the video forwards for you and let me know if you see what I see. First of all, please notice that the first scene is almost identical to the last scene. This is very unusual, if not unheard of, in Cartier watch commercials. Secondly, please look for a figure of the Antichrist. He appears only briefly in front of a huge image of a watch. And thirdly, please notice the various times given on the watches throughout this commercial, especially where they show a Cartier watch sideways, because in that case the time does not show 10 after 10, as is normal in Cartier watch commercials, but instead the time shows 1:25. So let's take a quick look at this commercial because it is a fascinating prophecy. Let's go through this Cartier watch commercial scene by scene. First of all, we see an image of their workshop over Paris, the Paris skyline, the same scene as we see at the end. And the time on the clock is 6 minutes before midnight. In other words, just before the end of the day. And that symbolizes the end times. And we know it's 6 before midnight because in a close-up in the next scene, we see the clock face very clearly in front of the Cartier workshop. And of course, 6 before 12 would give you 6 plus 6 plus 6. This is a prophecy about the Antichrist and the end of Barack Obama. Now, as the clock strikes midnight, we hear a dramatic intensity in the music, and there is a sudden brightening of this workshop. And there is an explosion. But what's really interesting is that the clock, I'm not sure if you can read this, if we look at it closely, the time reads 8:15. Now, is this commercial saying that on that date, that would be August 2015, there will be a nuclear explosion? Now, following the explosion, we see all kinds of clock parts flying throughout the workplace, and a very interesting image of a typical Cartier watch set at 10 after 10. But as you can read, it actually shows 1:25. Now, what would be the significance of 1:25? Is this another interesting or important time or date in prophecy? Following the watch on its side, we see several more scenes of watch parts flying throughout the workshop, which leads up to an image of the Antichrist standing in front of a huge watch face. Now, why do I say that this represents the Antichrist? Because he is standing in front of the number 6. That is not an accident. Next, we see the watch parts beginning to be assembled into a Leopard. And then a very unusual scene of the watch parts looking like a UFO. I mean, this could almost be a scene out of Star Wars. Now, what in the world does that have to do with watchmaking? Next, we see a watch part that looks like a crescent, which could be the symbol for the one world religion, except that it is also on its side. And that seems to be incorporated into a mark which appears on the forehead of the developing Leopard. And as the Leopard completes its construction, the mark on the forehead becomes more and more clear, and it definitely takes, at least somewhat, the shape of the number 6. In other words, the mark of the beast appears on the forehead of Barack Obama. Next, we see the completed Leopard made out of watch parts, and the watch part Leopard then transforms into a real Leopard. And I believe the hidden message of this video is that Barack Obama, who is a leopard in Bible prophecy, is merely a puppet of the Illuminati and the Antichrist. Finally, we see a man and his boy admiring the watches in a shop window. And of course, there are 4 watches. 4 is a very important end times number. Don't forget the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And at the very end, we see a leopard climbing the rooftops of Paris. And this final scene, the rooftops of Paris, is almost identical to the first scene. And in fact, I believe that is the clue the makers of this commercial are giving us, that this video should be seen in reverse, because that is where we will find all the secret messages from the Illuminati to their comrades. And please note, as you watch this video backwards, you won't find the obvious signs that you normally see in a reverse video. You don't find people walking backwards, for example. Even the music sounds as if it was written for it to be seen backwards. Let's take a look. So now we see that this commercial seems to work both backwards and forwards. And in fact, I believe from a biblical perspective, it works better backwards. Now first we see pairs of today. In other words, the last scene becomes the first scene. Notice that the sky is all lit up more than before. Even the Eiffel Tower is lit up. However, the time on the clock on the workplace of Cartier watches still reads a few minutes before midnight. In other words, this is still an end times prophecy. Now next we see the Leopard, and because we are watching the commercial in reverse, the Leopard does go backwards. However, is that a commentary on Barack Obama leading us in the wrong direction? Now next we see the 4 watches in the window, which I believe represent the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They are all set at 10 after 10. Please notice that the man and the boy admiring these watches are dressed in winter jackets. They have scarves on. They have their hands in their pockets. This is a cold day. I believe this is a prophecy about either the late fall or the early winter. Could it be that all those watches reading 10:10 are predicting a date of October the 10th? Next we see one of the 4 watches in the window close up with a red background. And that indicates the second horseman of the apocalypse, the red horse of war. And now the reason we know that this is one of the 4 watches which the man and the boy were admiring in the window is because we see the boy's reflection in the glass. However, this watch is also shown on its side. And the time in this case reads a few minutes before 7. And that could very well be the time that the man and the boy are looking at these watches. It doesn't seem likely that they would be out on the streets of Paris at midnight or at 10 after 10. However, if this scene is late fall or winter, it could very well be dark at 7 p.m. Next, the camera zooms in on the dial setting mechanism on the side of the watch. And if you look really close, you can see what I would have to consider a warship, either a submarine or a destroyer. In fact, you can even see the wake of this boat. Now, are the Illuminati trying to tell their comrades that there is going to be a naval attack? And is this naval attack part of an attack on the United States and Barack Obama? Now, following this naval attack, we see the destruction of the Leopard. Is this a prophecy of the downfall of both Barack Obama and the United States? Also, when you see this video in reverse, you become much more aware of the number 6 mark of the beast on the forehead of this leopard. Following the destruction of the Leopard, we see more chaos, more watch parts flying around the workshop, and this culminates in the UFO, a very strange image. Why is this in a watch commercial? Is this a prophecy of an alien invasion? Now, following the UFOs and the alien invasion, of course, we shouldn't be surprised. Next comes the Antichrist. Now, I'm going to loop this image of the Antichrist several times so that you can see that he is acting like an orchestra conductor. Notice that he is like moving his right hand as if he is orchestrating the end times. And of course, the Antichrist, as I said before, is standing in front of where the number 6 would be on a watch. And please note there are 3 flashes of light on the Antichrist. And I think that is where you get the 666. Now, following the Antichrist, there is a lot more chaos and destruction, naturally. Following the chaos and destruction, we see 2 watches showing 125. And I'm not sure what the meaning of that is. We will probably find out in the future. Then we see the flash of light in the workshop, and I'm sure that indicates bombing of Paris. And now we know the significance of that time of 8:15 on that clock. In other words, this does not occur at midnight, the beginning of the tribulation. And again, I'm not sure the significance of 8:15, as I said before. Maybe that refers to August 2015. And the last scene is the same as the first scene, except we see Paris basically of 100 years ago. There's no lights on the Eiffel Tower, for example. Does this indicate that the reign of the Antichrist is going to take Paris back 100 years? And of course, does this all follow the downfall of the Leopard? That is, the taking out of both the United States and Barack Obama. And so we see a completely different sequence of events when we watch this commercial in reverse. Now I know a lot of you are going to say that that is ridiculous. The makers of this commercial did not want this video watched in reverse. But let me also remind you that in Bible prophecy, the great prophecies of Daniel in his chapter number 12 must be read in reverse. So there is very important precedence. And now I want to leave you with one final note, which doesn't really have anything to do with this particular video, and that is that one of my subscribers, Peaches2811, has done a cover of my karaoke song, Hail Mary, and I'm going to put the link below, and I want you to watch this because I think it's great. And if you like it, would you please give her a thumbs up?